Stranded color work is the technique that looks so impressive in knitting in any garment. It elevates it just to the next level and it looks just so incredibly hard. But I promise you, it's not actually hard, it's just knitting. Welcome to Sorceress Crafts channel. I'm Spigina, or the Sorceress. I learned to knit in the previous century and I come from a culture with deep historical tradition of knitting color work. In this video, I will tell you literally everything that you need to know to get started with color work. I will cover all of the concepts that you need to know. I will cover what fibers to choose, what are floats, what are color dominants, what do you need to do. My goal is to give you all of the information that you need in this video, so after watching this you can go and knit your first color work garment or first color work accessory. Before you ask if there's any relevant details about what I'm wearing or about any patterns that I'll be showing in this video, all of the information about patterns, yarns that I used will be in the description. So first of all, what even is stranded color work? Stranded color work is a knitting method where you are creating a motif with two or more colors and you are using all of the colors kind of simultaneously, and by changing which color yarn do you use to make this current stitch, you are making different patterns. The motifs that you can create with the color work are literally endless. You can create like geometric patterns. You can create like drawings or drawings like this. You can create like abstract patterns, or you can even create vertical stripes like this, or like a seemingly random pattern. You do this by knitting the stitch with one color and leaving the other color behind the work. So one side will look like this, where you have like your drawing, your motif, and the other side will look like this, where you have floats. Stranded color work creates a doubly thick fabric, so it will be more durable, it will be more warm, and very often it will also be less stretchy. So historically, when we see all of those crazy color work mittens and socks, they are made that way just to be pretty, even though they are also made to just be pretty. Being pretty is a legitimate reason to knit color work, and it's one of the reasons why people did that. But people also used color work to make their garments more durable and warmer for harsh winters. So an all-over color work sock will always be more durable than just plain stockinette sock. And all-over color work mittens will always be warmer than just plain mittens. Those are also some of the reasons why people have always been knitting color work. In any yarn craft, the most important question that you need to ask yourself is, what fibers are you going to use for this project? And of course, colorwork knitting is no exception. If you spend any time on knitting forums or like social media around knitting, you will discover people who will tell you that you can't knit colorwork with cotton, or that you can't knit colorwork with superwash yarn, that you only need the most rustic wool yarn that you can ever find. These people are obviously wrong, and they are either speaking from a very confident ignorance, or they are the worst case of yarn snobs, and in this household we support none of those. You can knit colorwork in any yarn that you want and that you like to use. But with that being said, there are certainly some yarns that will be easier to use in the colorwork, and then there are yarns that will require more experience and a better understanding on how to knit colorwork. So yes, your rustic wool yarns will always be the easiest choice for knitting colorwork. Rustic wool yarns are grippy, they hold shape very well, they don't slip around, usually they also have pretty good stitch definition, and you will see your work coming along beautifully. Therefore, I would advise practicing colorwork on wool yarns, and specifically non-superwash yarns. However, if you are like me and you have very sensitive skin, rustic wool yarns won't really be all that wearable for you. And when I knit sweaters like these, I want to wear them as much as I can. So your next easiest option for knitting colorwork would be choosing a wool yarn that you are capable of wearing, but that's not super treated or that's not too slippery. So maybe superfine merino would work for you, or like any of the specialty sheep breeds that have less itchier wool. But of course, I'm also a walking example that you absolutely can knit a colorwork sweater in cotton. This sweater that I'm currently wearing is knit in mercerized cotton, and I absolutely had a lovely time knitting with it. I absolutely love working with cotton, but there are a few things that you need to know. First of all, cotton is a stiffer yarn, so for some people it might be harder on hands. Unlike wool, cotton doesn't fill out the spaces between stitches. Every single tension mistake, every single mistake will be really visible. So if you want to knit with cotton, you need to have good tension, and you need to be careful about making your stitches really uniform. That's why knitting color work with cotton can be a slight challenge. But it's absolutely doable, and I've done it a lot, and it's not really as hard as people make it sound. And honestly, knitting with cotton is just your personal preference, and if you already like working with cotton, it's very likely that you will actually enjoy knitting color work in cotton too. Another fiber option that people with sensitive skin like to use are superwash yarns. And those two you can use for color work. For example, this is a swatch for the sweater that I'm working on, and I'm working it with Drops Cotton Merino, which is a superwash merino and cotton blend. As you can see, it's absolutely possible to knit color work with superwash yarn. But of course, there are a few things that you need to take in account. First of all, not all superwash yarns are created equal. Some of the superwash yarns are heavily coated, and so they will be very slippery, very smooth, and those yarns will make it harder to keep your tension and create equal stitches. And especially on places like these where there's just one stitch, they might come out like blobby or uneven. And if you're knitting with a yarn like that, you need to decide how much do you like the end result that you're getting. And you of course do that by knitting a swatch, blocking it, and then checking what you're getting. I'll get to that later in this video. But then there are other superwash yarns that are very mildly treated, and they still have a little bit fluff around them, and they still stick together very nicely. They are treated only to the point that they wouldn't really felt that much and that they would feel very nice on the skin, but they are not like very slick yarns. So when it comes to superwash yarns, there really is no one advice that fits all. You need to knit your swatch, you need to look at the yarn that you have, and you need to decide, is it working for you? Some superwash yarns will be very easy to work with. For example, here I have my swatch for socks that I will be knitting with Filcolana Arwetta, and this is like a fairly grippy yarn. It knits up in color work just absolutely marvelously. I had zero issues knitting with it. It felt like I'm knitting with just any regular wool yarn. And meanwhile, when I started working on this swatch, I realized that like, okay, this is a bit more heavier coated yarn, and this yarn is harder to work with, and even after blocking, there will be some places that won't be completely even. I'm just completely fine with that. And then there are a few fiber types that I think you should maybe avoid as your first project. First type of yarn would be super fluffy yarns. So right here I knit a swatch with Drops Air, which is a blown yarn, so it has very little structure and the fluff is going all over the place. And because each yarn has so much fluff, they tend to catch together and they tend to like bleed into each other, and the fluff gets caught, and basically you would start seeing fluff of the other yarn in front of the work where you don't want to see it. You can absolutely knit color work with it, but maybe don't start with it. And then another option that I would suggest you leave maybe for later when you're more experienced with color work is knitting with yarn held double with mohair. You absolutely can knit gorgeous stranded color work with mohair yarns where you are holding one yarn and then mohair together, but I highly suggest you avoid that for your first few projects because it's already quite a learning curve how to manipulate two yarns at the same time, and then if both colors are consisting of several strands of yarn, that just makes it exponentially harder. Basically what I'm trying to say here about fibers, you can use any yarn that you like for knitting stranded color work. It's just that grippier yarns will be easier to knit with, and meanwhile slicker or a bit stiffer yarns will be harder to work with and you will need to put in more effort into knitting with them. But if your tension is already good, you really won't have that many issues around color work. And while it's definitely important to choose yarns that you enjoy working with, I always want to consider also how they will wear, and I want to consider the fact that I want to really wear my knits. So that's the reason why I'm not creating color work sweaters in like very rustic wool yarn, because those sweaters would have extremely limited use for me. Now, when you have chosen the fiber to work with, the next thing that you need to choose are colors. And the most important bit about choosing colors is that you need to choose colors that will have enough color contrast for the motif to come across and not get lost. There are some cases where it's extremely easy to tell that, like, okay, this will be a very good contrast. Like, you can look at this beige and brown yarn and immediately tell that, yeah, those have an amazing contrast. But there are other cases where the contrast on our eyes can be very deceptive. For example, I bought these yarns to work together in a colourwork socks, and because I sometimes tend to be overconfident in my skills, I started knitting a swatch without actually properly checking if those yarns have enough contrast. And then I had started the swatch and I realized that, like, I basically can't see the motif at all. And there's a super easy trick how to learn if the yarns that you have chosen have enough color contrast for you to actually see the motif that you're knitting. What you will want to do is take a quick picture with both yarns together, turn that picture black and white without any filters, without doing anything special, just turn it black and white. And if you can still tell the yarns apart when they are black and white in the picture, you have a very good color contrast. Or rather, the yarns that you have chosen have enough difference in the color values for the pattern to come across nicely. If you can't tell those yarns apart, as it happened in this case, well, then you will have the situation like I had, where you will start knitting and you will not be able to actually see the motif that you're knitting. And sure, sometimes it's really fun to make like a muted design that's almost like fades into the background, but then it needs to be a conscious choice and you need to be aware that that's what you're doing. But if you want to knit like a fairly traditional color work where you want to see the details, and especially if you want to knit color work where you have only one stitch of like the contrasting color against the background, then the contrasting color really needs to pop against the background. And then you need to choose yarn that will have enough contrast. So while these two yarns did not have enough contrast, these two yarns actually have enough contrast and they make an amazing pattern. It's still maybe not the most contrasty, but I really like the effect that this is making, and this is visible enough for my taste. Now, you have chosen your yarns, you have chosen your colors, it's time to sit down and knit. In this video, I won't fully cover all of the colorwork knitting techniques. I have a separate video for that. After you watch this one and you have learned everything you need to know about colorwork knitting, you can go watch that one and see all of the technical aspects of knitting, and I cover all of the continental knitting styles there, so Western combination and Eastern. If you're an English knitter, you can adjust what I'm saying there, but I'm not giving like specific instructions for English knitters. But don't get discouraged. The second method that I'm showing there, where you're working with only holding one strand of yarn, is the one that will also apply to English knitting. Everything that I'm saying there will also apply. One of the main things that sets color work apart from just your regular knitting is that you need to manage floats at the back of your knit. First of all, what even is a float in color work? So floats are those stretches of the yarn that you have on the back side of your work. It's basically a byproduct of knitting color work, because when you knit stranded color work like this, you are creating the motif by knitting one yarn at a time. And here where I have the orange yarn in the front, I will have a black float in the back. Floats are supposed to sit snug at the fabric, but they can never pull on the fabric. The ideal length of a float is exactly as long as the stitches it's covering are wide. So right here I have two orange stitches that will be showing on the front, and on the back side of them I have the black float. So the float has to be exactly as long as those two stitches are wide. But when we're talking about float length, we don't always refer to float going from one stitch to another. If the floats are too long, we can also catch them, and then the float length is referred as the length from the stitch to the place where you caught it. Float management is the thing that will either break or make your color knit work. And I think one of the biggest confusions for new knitters is how long should the float be? And honestly, I understand where the confusion stems from, because the answer is always like, well, it depends. which is not a helpful answer. So let's talk about the factors on which it depends. First, you need to understand why float management is important. The main bit about float management is that when you're wearing your garment, you don't want the floats to get caught on. Like maybe when you're putting on a sweater, you don't want your fingers to catch on the floats, or you don't want the floats to catch on anything you're wearing underneath the sweater. So that is always the main reason why we are managing floats. The second reason why you should consider managing your floats is that it will help you even out your tension. Shorter floats will always create less issues with your tension. When I say leaving shorter floats, I don't mean that you are leaving float that's shorter than the stitches. No, what I mean is how often do you want to catch them? Of course, experienced knitters will have to think about that less, but especially in the beginning, it's a very good idea to keep an eye on your floats and manage them in order to help with your tension. Now, how long should they be? As a very general rule, my preference is to leave floats that are no longer than 2 centimeters. It's not a hard rule for me, and I don't always stick to that, but it's just a rule that I kind of observe and then I tweak depending on what I'm knitting, and that might be a rule that's helpful for you too. So let's talk about the factors on which it depends. First of all, how long do you want to leave your floats? Depends on your fiber. If you are knitting with fiber that will felt down a bit, and if you are knitting with a grippy fiber, you can afford to leave longer floats because they will not slip and slide around, and while you are wearing them, the fabric will get felted down a bit, and it will basically create 0 problems. On the other hand, if you are knitting with more slippy yarns that are prone to like moving around, like if you're knitting with superwash yarn or if you're knitting with mercerized cotton, then you will probably want to leave shorter floats. Float management is also one of the reasons why for beginners we usually tend to recommend patterns where you don't need to really catch the floats and where you are naturally changing the yarns in quite short and regular intervals. And that way you can just think about changing the yarns and not about catching floats. That is a very good place where to begin knitting color work. And then later on move on to pieces where you maybe need to start catching floats because there are longer stretches of just one color and then you need to manage that other color. Like for example in this design, there are a few rows where the background color is stretching almost all across the pattern. And so I need to catch the floats more often. So this is not something that I would recommend for beginners. Another thing that you want to keep an eye on when it comes to floats is how smoothly they are sitting on your fabric. Your floats should not be sagging anywhere down, and also they should not be pulling on your fabric. The floats always have to be the same length as is the width of the stitches that it's covering from the behind. So if you start seeing that your floats are like hanging down, you are knitting too loose and you need to tighten them up. On the other hand, if you start seeing your fabric bunching up or like puckering up, then that means that your floats are too tight and you need to loosen them up. But honestly, once you start knitting color work, you very quickly will start understanding how floats work and how they interact with your fabric, and you will very quickly discover like what is your preference for how to keep the floats. To give you a few examples from my knitting life, I usually don't really bother catching floats when I'm knitting socks, because socks will get felted down very quickly, they will wear together very quickly, so I don't really need to worry about that. Meanwhile, when I'm knitting sweaters or something that I will want to put on and off and where I will be sticking my fingers in, there I want to leave very short floats because I don't want to snag them with my fingers. What I usually like to do is when I'm knitting a swatch, I will check what is the longest float that kind of feels comfortable for me, and then I will just make a note for myself that I need to catch floats, for example, in every 5 stitches if it's relevant for that situation. And of course it all depends on like what weight you're knitting with and like what yarn you're knitting with. Again, that's why you need to make a swatch and check those things. But it's just a very easy way how to approach your pattern knitting where you are not like constantly thinking about it, where you just have like a rule for this specific pattern, that like in this pattern, I'm not leaving any floats that are longer than 5 stitches. An important thing is that you almost never want to catch floats on the same stitch or on the same column as in the previous row. You want to stagger catching your floats, otherwise you risk creating like a very visible vertical line in your knit on the right side. And to avoid that line, you want to simply stagger where you are catching the floats. And you don't always need to catch the floats right in the middle of the stitches. You can just move them around a bit. I understand that this is very much like, oh, just go with the vibes, because it kinda is. But if you just follow a bit of common sense and you understand how your fibers work, and if you see how the floats work in your swatch, you will really quickly understand what you actually need to do for that specific pattern. One of the most misunderstood concepts in stranded colorwork knitting might be the color dominance. So what is color dominance and how does that apply to your work? Simply speaking, color dominance refers to which color goes underneath and which color goes over the other yarn when you are switching the yarns on the back side. Technically, it has to do with how much the yarn has to travel on the back side. The yarn that will travel underneath will take less space, and therefore it will also kind of pop up more in the front, and the yarn that's going over will take up more space and it will kind of step back in the background more, relatively speaking. So that's why you always want your dominant color go underneath and your non-dominant color go over. And the same principle applies if you're also knitting with more than one color. You'll just want to rank them, who is the most dominant, then the next dominant, and then the non-dominant color. In the video where I show different techniques for knitting colorwork, I also show how to hold proper color dominance for each and every of those techniques, so you can go check that out. But there isn't like more science or more technique to that, just that you are holding one yarn is always going underneath the other yarn is always going over. But how do you decide which yarn should be dominant and which yarn should be the non-dominant yarn? There are many different ways how to approach that. Very often pattern will tell you which is the dominant, which is the non-dominant color. Very often in the patterns they won't be called dominant and non-dominant yarns, but often it will be said that you have main color and you have the contrast color, and this gets a bit counterintuitive, but you will understand why. Main color is the background color, so it's the non-dominant color. For example, in this sweater, main color or non-dominant color is the gray one because it's the background. And then the contrast color or the dominant color is the yellow one because that's the one that's creating the motif and that's the one that you want to pop off more. But what if your pattern hasn't told you that? Or what if you're not using a pattern, you're just using like some sort of motif that you found? Then there are several ways how you can approach it. First, look at your motif and see if you can determine that one of those colors really looks like a background. If you have that, if there's one color where you think that like, okay, this is background, and then very clearly the other color is the one that's creating the motif, then the background color is non-dominant and the motif color is the dominant yarn. Another way how to think about it, if there's places where the yarn shows up only for one stitch and then you switch it away, then very often you will want to put that yarn that shows up only for one stitch as the dominant yarn. Because in the places where you have only one stitch, it's very prone to getting lost in the other stitches. This little swatch is a great example for how color dominance can really drown out some of your stitches. So here in the bottom, yellow yarn was the dominant one. And you can really see it creating neat lines. And here on the top, I changed nothing else. I simply changed which color is the dominant. So here the blue yarn is dominant color. And you can see that in several places the yellow stitches are getting lost in the fabric. And this is entirely down to color dominance. Nothing else was changed between those two sides. Very often you will also want to put the lighter color as the dominant yarn and the darker color as the non-dominant yarn. But the most important thing that you always need to remember is just to keep consistent color dominance. it isn't always that important which is the dominant and which is the non-dominant yarn. It's simply important that you are not mixing them up. And when you're knitting your swatch, I suggest that you should actually try both ways. So on the bottom of the swatch, try knitting one color as the dominant color, and then when you have finished the repeat and go for another repeat of the same motif, change them around. And I don't mean start mixing them, no, change which is now the dominant color. This is a swatch for socks that I will be making, and this is a great example of how color dominance can make a very subtle change that other people might not notice, but you might prefer. So for the first bit of this swatch, brown color was the dominant color, and you can really see that it's showing up more. And then for the second repeat up here, I changed it up and I made the blue or the background color the dominant color. And even though both options look beautiful, I personally, in this particular case, prefer to have the blue color as the dominant color. Sometimes you will discover very interesting things, and sometimes you will just visually see which is your preference. And it has to do with like how the motif is made and just like what I like about it. You might have different preferences. So I just want to encourage you, experiment and see which way do you like it better. Just know that you need to keep consistent color dominance, and the absolutely biggest mistake that you can make is keep switching the yarns, going over and over and over the same way and like never going back and forth. A very good way how to tell if you are making a mistake is if you start seeing that your yarns get tangled up and you need to untangle them all of the time. That means you are not holding proper color dominance. And that is also one of the reasons why color dominance is so great. Knitting with tangled yarns is just a miserable experience. And so changing them in the correct order back and forth also helps you keep yarns from tangling up. I have already mentioned swatching a lot in this video, and in knitting stranded colorwork, swatching is super important, and it is the thing that might save or break your project. And no, I'm not exaggerating. It's very important to swatch colorwork because we need to check for several things. Of course, you need to know your gauge if you want to follow a pattern or if you want to build up your own garment. If you are not getting the gauge that you need, the garment simply won't fit you. Another reason is that stranded colorwork is very often at a different gauge than just knitting plain stockinette. For most people, stranded colorwork will be tighter than just knitting plain, but there are also people out there who have it looser. It completely depends on how you knit, and neither of those options are wrong or right. It's just how knitting works. And so you need to determine what needle sizes you need to use if you are going to knit a sweater where you have both plain stockinette and stranded colorwork, because most people will need to switch the needle size when they move from one technique to the other. It's very likely that you won't be able to knit the whole sweater with just one needle size. So that's why it's important to swatch both the plain stockinette and the colorwork bit, and then you can compare. Another super important reason is that you need to see if the colors will bleed after you block them. So of course you always need to block your swatches, and of course you need to block them in the same exact way as you will be blocking your garment. Checking on the swatch if the yarns will bleed will save you from a lot of heartbreak. You really don't want to finish all of that great work only to suddenly realize that your work is ruined by blocking simply because the colors aren't holding on, simply because they aren't steadfast. Sadly, that sometimes can happen with yarn, where basically one of the colors will bleed and it will kinda over dye the other color. Swatching will save you from that fate. Then of course I already mentioned that swatch is a great place where to determine what color dominance you want to use. And again, I recommend knitting half of the swatch in one dominance and other swatch in a different one. Color dominance does not change your gauge, and so you will be able to see which option you like better. And of course, as was the case with this project for me, you will also see if you like the fabric that you are getting. You will see if you like the color contrast that you are getting. You will see if the motif is popping off enough for your taste. And of course, it's super important to know that you always swatch in the same exact way as you will be knitting your garment. So if you're knitting your garment on round, you also need to swatch on round. And that means that like when you are knitting your swatch, you finish your row and then you slide all of the stitches back to the left hand needle and start knitting again. And there are two ways how to handle the yarn for this. The way that I use most often, specifically for color work, is cutting off the yarn ends at each row, tying them off, and then restarting the yarn, tying the knot in the front, knitting the row, tying the knot in the end, cutting off the yarn. The reason why I do this is that it helps to keep more even tension, as opposed to the swatches where I keep the whole yarn at the back of the work. With this method, the yarns are more slippy at the sides, and especially if you are knitting some sort of motif here, it will be very hard to determine if your tension is good. So basically, I would choose this method only if I'm really worried about the yarn amounts that I have and if I need to frog the swatch back and use that yarn in my garment, or if I'm maybe knitting with like a super grippy yarn. This swatch was not a great experience, but I just knit it in this way so I could show you how it's done. And by the way, the tension is not an issue with this type of swatches when you're knitting just like plain stockinette, because there you have only one yarn and it's holding on itself very nicely. But because with stranded color work, you are already switching the yarns and they are not holding on so tightly, it's a bit harder to keep tension with this method. Therefore, for color work, I usually prefer to do this where I cut off each end. It takes a bit more time, but it makes for a nicer knitting experience. And if you're generally not sure like how to make proper swatches or why do you actually need swatches, I have a whole playlist there with short, concise videos where I explain why swatching is so important in knitting. And of course, I suggest you knit up several swatches before you actually start working on your color work garment. Swatches are the greatest place where you can practice, and it's a great little project where you can really understand if you like what you're doing or if you need to tweak something. One of the biggest issues beginner knitters might run into is how to keep the fabric nice and smooth. As I mentioned in the floats section, the biggest contributor to very nice smooth fabric will be how you manage your floats. So you always need to keep your floats an appropriate length for the fabric that you are creating, and the best way how to ensure that is to never bunch up the stitches on your right hand needle. So normally when you're knitting just with one color, we can bunch up the stitches as much as we want. It's no issue at all. It makes for a very fast knitting and it is very convenient. When we're knitting color work, we can bunch up on the left hand needle because that won't impact the length of your floats. But you always want to keep a smooth fabric on your right hand needle. Otherwise, it's very likely that you will leave floats that are too short for the fabric that you're creating. And it's worth noting that because of how technically stranded color work works, blocking very often won't save all of your issues. Of course, it will save some. It will save some tension issues, it will save some unevenness, but if you start seeing that your fabric is really bunching up, it's very likely that it will stay the same way after blocking too, because blocking can't resolve all of the issues, and if the issue is that you simply haven't left enough yarn for your fabric to work, then well, blocking can't help you there. On the other hand, if you start seeing that some of your stitches are really expanding, like if they are getting long or if they are getting out of proportion, that very often means that you are leaving floats that are too long and the yarn is simply stretching out, and that's why some of the stitches are getting bigger. In those cases, you need to check the floats and leave them a bit shorter. And I already mentioned this, but very often for stranded color work, you will need to use needles that are few sizes larger than what you're using for your plain stockinette. Normally I need to go just one size larger, but that will depend on your knitting style. You might need to go 2 sizes larger. Nobody else can tell you that. Only your swatch can answer you this question on how bigger the needle should be for your stranded color work. Or maybe it should be smaller if you're one of those people who actually knits the stranded color work looser than the plain stockinette. And of course, choosing fibers that you find pleasant and easy to work with will also help you to achieve fabric that's very nice and looks very even. most often color work will be given you in a chart form. It's very rare that color work would be given in like written form, and it also would be so extremely hard to work for that I never recommend doing that. Instead, let's talk about how to read charts. And I promise it's actually super easy. For color work charts, you will mostly see the colored squares, and then it will be described which square is which color. Of course, there also might be some increases or decreases. All of that will be described in the pattern. Another thing that you will see in the patterns quite often is the repeat border. So it will usually be like a colored border around some of the stitches, and that means that if you just knit those stitches on repeat, you will get the whole pattern. Main thing you need to understand about knitting from charts is that charts only show the right side of your knit. So it's very easy if you're knitting on round. You start reading from right to left, and you just go stitch by stitch on what's shown here. If you're knitting on round, then for the second row, you will again go from right to left. However, if you're knitting on flat, then on the even rows, you will read the chart from left to right. And of course, then those would be purl stitches. So here for the row 1, I would have 1 contrast color and 5 main color stitches. And then I would just repeat it for the whole row. On the second row, I would have 1 main, 1 contrast color, 3 main, and 1 contrast color stitch, and again repeat it for the whole row. And in this case, when I would have finished the 6 rows of this repeat, I would start from the row 1 again. As you can see here, I made the chart larger for you so you could see the repeats, but all of those 7 stitches by 6 rows are exactly the same. You could divide them in all of those rectangles and they would be exactly the same. One of the ways how I make color knitting easier for myself, after I have knit few rows, I stop thinking about 1 contrast, 5 main, 1 main, 1 contrast, 3 main, 1 contrast, because that's kind of not intuitive for my brain. So here on knitting row 3, I would be looking on what I already have on the needles. So I would have the row 2 on needles, and I would know that I have to knit 1 stitch past this contrasting color and then make a contrasting color stitch. And when I knit, I basically never think about the background color. I just think about when I need to put in the contrast color. And especially when I would be knitting patterns like these, where they are not geometric, they are just making images, it's way easier for me to think that like, okay, on this row, I just need to knit up to the black yarn and then make a black stitch. And then again, I keep knitting until I reach the black stitch and make a black stitch again. It kind of sounds convoluted when I'm trying to explain it, but once you try knitting that way, it really clicks for lots of people and it makes reading the patterns way easier. And knitting color work from charts is really satisfying because you will be seeing exactly the same image on your knitting as you are already seeing in the chart. Even the most experienced knitters make mistakes. It's just a reality of knitting and crafting and just life in general. We make mistakes. It's unreasonable for us to expect that we won't make any mistakes. So what are the easy ways of fixing mistakes in color work? First of all, I will say this. Color work usually tends to be quite busy, and the first thing I will always do is I will look at the garment and I will see if I actually need to fix the mistake. Like this sweater has so many mistakes in it. I never bothered fixing them because you could never find them just by looking at me. And even if you could, I just don't care. So that is my main advice to you. Take a step back from your knitting. Don't look at it this close as we are used to when we are knitting. Like we usually have our knitting very much in our face and we are aware of the mistakes to like an extreme level. But when we step back, we can really appreciate like, is that mistake really noticeable? If not, I don't bother with fixing it. However, if there is a color work mistake that you actually need to fix, in some cases you will be able to do the traditional way of you drop some of the stitches and then pick them up with a crochet hook or with your knitting needles. If you're not sure about what I'm talking, I have a tutorial for that here. But in stranded color work, it only works in separate cases. It won't work always. The thing that you need to understand is that the floats that we are leaving behind the fabric are always shorter than the yarn amount that's used for the stitch. So if the mistake that you have made is that like you would need to switch places for 2 stitches, like for example you need the stitch with the dominant color but you needed to make it with the non-dominant color, and then right next to it you have the opposite situation, then you can drop the stitches and just knit up with the correct colors. However, if you realize that you have knit with one color but you actually needed to do the other color there, then the dropping of the stitches won't really work because you haven't left yourself enough yarn for the color that you actually needed there. And when you will leave the other color that you had knitted up and now you're leaving it as a float, it will be very saggy, very long float. Sometimes you will be able to do that. Sometimes you can do it with some creativity, but it won't always be the best way how to solve mistakes. Another way that you might consider is doing the duplicate stitch after you have finished the garment. So here's how you work a duplicate stitch. Duplicate stitch is basically an embroidery that will be doing over 1 knit stitch at a time. You will need a darning needle and you need to use the yarn that you want to be visible there. So I've made an error here. This should have been the brown stitch instead of it being blue. So we'll be changing that. Insert needle from behind of your fabric at the bottom of your stitch, pull through, and on the wrong side leave a yarn end that you will weave in afterwards. Now go up to the stitch leg, insert your tapestry needle, and immediately come up on the other stitch leg. So it will almost look like you are going under the next stitch, pull yarn through. We have now covered the first leg, and now go back to the beginning of the stitch and insert the needle from the front to behind and pull yarn through. And you have successfully created a duplicate stitch, and this will now show up as the brown stitch instead of the blue. Everything tends to be scary until we have actually tried it and practiced a bit. So I understand that even after all of this information, which admittedly is quite an amount of information here, you might still be wary about like, okay, but how do I get to my first pattern? Which pattern do I choose? What even is a beginner friendly pattern? So let's talk about it. How do you find patterns that will be friendly for your knitting skill? You could always rely on other knitters' suggestions, and sometimes it will be very useful, sometimes it won't. But please, if you have already knit a colourwork pattern and you really liked it, please leave it in the comments and tell me and other beginner knitters what are the patterns that are maybe good for starting. For looking up patterns, we will go to the Ravelry and we will immediately go to the advanced search. And now here we will want to set up the parameters what we are looking for. First of all, our craft is knitting. It should have photo. I don't really know why are there patterns without photos. That's a completely different rant though. Category for now you can leave empty if you want. We'll talk about that later. The important bit is here to the attributes. We will want to choose the colourwork and we want the stranded colourwork option. For beginners, I would suggest going with a bit heavier weight yarn, so maybe DK, worsted and Aran. And also I suggest going to the colors used and selecting only 2, because only 2 colors will be easier to manage. Now here we have opened all sorts of knitting patterns, and while they all look impressive, it might be a bit hard to choose which ones actually might be easy for you to do. So what you could do is in the parameters look at the difficulty and choose like maybe first 4 or 3 options. And now we can see that the selection is already quite reduced. However, there are still 65 pages of the patterns and it still might be really difficult to understand what to look for, so let's talk about it. First of all, I will say that starting your colourwork journey with a sweater might be a bit too harsh, and easier patterns to knit would be all sorts of hats or cowls Or honestly, if you already have experience with knitting socks, you might also go with socks. From here on, you can start looking at the patterns that catch your eye. Like for example, this Bergman hat seems to be quite easy. Caitlin Hunter is also a quite well-known designer. It's a worsted weight, and an important bit about this pattern, it doesn't change too much. It's a very geometric pattern, and therefore it will be easier to knit. So when you're choosing beginner-friendly patterns, I would suggest avoiding patterns like these where it's like a drawing, because every single line will be very different and you will need to pay a lot of attention to the charts. Of course, it doesn't mean that you can't knit that. I always keep saying that when you're learning new technique, you absolutely should be choosing something that sparks your interest, because those things will keep you going through some frustrations. However, if you are specifically looking for patterns that will be easier, I highly suggest looking at patterns where it's like an easy repeat and where it's like geometric patterns, maybe something like this. And by the way, I'm not specifically endorsing any one of those patterns that I have shown just now. I'm literally just going over the search and seeing what catches my eye, because that is fully how I would choose patterns for my first adventures in new techniques. I would look at something that I really want to make, and then I would check if it kinda suits my skill level. Another great help for beginner knitters will be looking at the projects. And here for the filters, click on the all helpful projects and see through the notes that people have left. Right here, someone is saying that it's a clear and simple pattern. And here too, the person seems to be very satisfied with what they made, and it was their first ever colourwork haul. So that would be a great option where to start. And by the way, let me know if you would be interested in me making like a more curated pattern selection and making a separate video about it, where I would be selecting and actually looking at more patterns that I could suggest for beginners. So leave a comment below if you think that that's something that would be useful for you. Another thing you need to pay attention when choosing your first colourwork, it changes colors quite often, and that the stretches of just one color aren't too long. I think 5 to 7 stitches between color changes would be the absolute maximum that I would recommend for beginners. But honestly, smaller stretches of just one color before you need to change it to a different one will be way easier to manage, because if you have only 2 or 3 stitches of each color, you don't really need to think about catching floats, and you will have easier time getting used to knitting color work. I just want to briefly mention few of the designers that I have heard lots of positive reviews about from beginner knitters. In no particular order, I would suggest Jamie Lomax or Pacific Knit Co. Her patterns are really interesting in the sense that they are doodle patterns, and it means you get like a base pattern and then you get like little charts of the color work, and you can arrange them in any way you want, and therefore you are getting like a very unique piece for yourself. And when you go through the projects of her patterns, you will see that people have used up those charts in variety of different ways. And of course, I will write down in the description all of the designers that I'm mentioning here. Stone Knits is an absolutely delightful designer. You can also see her socials. It's so fun to follow her. And her specialty are really fun socks. And I've heard just so many great reviews of her patterns, and specifically from beginners who very often keep saying that like stone knit patterns are the first ones that really got them into knitting color work. And she often also makes like very seasonal knits, so you could get like I'm Batty for Halloween, and this would be like a very easy repeat for a beginner to make. But she also has other patterns where there's color work only on the cuff, and that would also be an easy way how to start. Now, if you really don't want to start with a smaller project and you are determined that you really need to start with a sweater, the absolute first designer that I will suggest to you is Jennifer Steingass. She is just incredible with color work. Her patterns are well written, and she has lots of patterns that have easy repeats and that will be really accessible for beginners. like the Arwetta is one of the easiest patterns I've seen from her. But of course there's also others, and her style is really nice. And one of the great things about her patterns is that she designs round yokes really well. Most of her patterns are size inclusive, but be careful with her older patterns, because in the older patterns there might be some that aren't size inclusive. And then another designer that I want to mention is Rebecca Clow, or Crea Bea. While her specialty isn't specifically colorwork, she also has several colorwork sweaters, and she is absolutely great with size inclusivity, and her patterns are so well tested always. She usually does like huge test calls, and I've had an amazing experience with her patterns, and I think that this particular sweater would be quite accessible to beginners too. I sincerely hope that this video has answered your questions about how to knit stranded colorwork, but if you have any further questions or concerns, please leave them in comments and I will do my best to try and answer you. I truly appreciate you for watching my videos, and if you would like to support me making videos like these where I give a lot of information about how to knit, you can also support me on my Buy Me Coffee account. You can either choose one-time payment or like subscription model, but a quick note about that account: there is no extra content there because I don't want any of my tutorials, any of my knitting information to be locked behind the paywall, because I truly believe that the world would be a better place if everyone had the opportunity to learn crafts without having to pay for that knowledge. And because this knowledge was freely shared with me, I also want to pass it further. I want to freely share it with other people. So your support in the Buy Me Coffee account will be for the videos that I have already made and for the future ideas, experiments and information that I would like to put in the videos. But don't worry if you can't afford that. I just truly appreciate you watching this video to the end. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.